All right. So today we got some, this is more of a fun talk, a little bit about New Zealand, a little bit how they handle opioids and addiction in New Zealand. So yeah, we're going to have Dr. Allen on. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So it's the announcements. We got a ton of great talks coming up, and I'm really looking forward to Isaac coming on. He's been on multiple times before. We're going to be talking a little bit about telehealth, which actually is, as many of you know, there's been some talk that some of the telehealth for Suboxone may be changed, some of the regulations surrounding that, which we're all watching very closely because we do some televisits. So lots of great talks coming up, and we have a number of other ones that we're going to be adding to this that are kind of on the back burner. So next slide, Katie. Remember, if you want the CME, make sure you fill that all out. And just understand if there's somebody else in your room, please just send a little message to Katie and she'll get you all set up so that we can make sure everybody gets their CME. And again, Matt would love to see people's faces. So feel free to throw on your video. We don't care if you're eating, doesn't matter. And remember, if you need a little bit of help, Erin, as you can see, is also her video's on. You can call her with some different issues, or Heather or myself. Our phone numbers are there. So just give us a ring if there's something that you need help with. We certainly get a lot of calls with a lot of interesting issues, especially with fentanyl. So next slide. Remember the Center for Opioids Resources and Education. That's going to have our manual on it here pretty shortly. But there's lots of information on there as a part of our program. So feel free to go there if you're looking for different protocols and different things that might be useful. And remember the Addiction Connection podcast. The latest one that came out was on the substance use disorder and transgender care from our talk last week. It's actually been a very popular talk. We had a lot of downloads of that. So pretty interesting. And we have some other stuff coming up, including my favorite. I'm doing one on compassion fatigue. We did, that'll be out in the next couple of weeks as well, which was pretty interesting stuff. So with that, do you want to share your slides, Dr. Allen, or would you prefer Katie runs them?
If it's okay, I'll just share my slides.
Okay, Katie, we'll let him share then. So we have Dr. Allen, who's many of you may remember was from Mora, and he was one of their Suboxone providers there. He took a year break and he found himself in New Zealand and coming back soon. And I think Christy Bryant's going to be happy when he's back in the clinic and taking up some of the slack. So go ahead, Matt, if you want to say anything else or introduce yourself any other way, go ahead, and then we'll let you kind of get to your talk.
All right, I'll work on sharing my screen here.
Yeah, she says she's going to be very happy when you're back in the clinic. Perfect.
There we go. So I'm Matt Allen. I'm a GP. I work in Mora. I've been doing Suboxone now for since 2018. And we moved to New Zealand in June of last year. We've kind of been planning on this trip for probably the last 10 years. COVID put a little damper on it. But we were able to kind of push forward, and we uprooted our family and moved to Wanganui, New Zealand. In Mora, I've been doing full spectrum family medicine since 2010. I'm from Cambridge, which is just 30 minutes south of Mora. So it worked out well to be close to family and close, but not too close. And as I said, we moved here in June of last year, and we'll be here for the full year. So we will officially come back to Mora on July 15th. And I will slowly start immersing myself into the U.S. culture again, and probably be back working somewhere around August 1st. I'm sure nobody's heard of Wanganui. I hadn't heard of Wanganui before moving here. One of my partners, Jack Schwinghammer, actually lived in Wanganui for a year. He kind of did the same thing that I did in 2010. So he did exactly what I did and picked up and left. And he still works at Mora. So I asked him a couple of years ago. I said, well, if you could go anywhere in New Zealand, where would you want to go? And he said, hands down, he would go back to Wanganui. And he's not wrong. It's great. We live, if you could see the day, if it was daylight here, you could see I have a golf course behind my house and the ocean in front of my house. We lucked into an incredible house here. But it is 6:15 in the morning. So the sun is yet to come up. So I was supposed to help it happen. This nice, big, beautiful backdrop of this green, lush golf course to show all you guys while it's snowing out there. But alas, the sun has not come up yet. So you might get it by the end of this talk, though. So Wanganui is about 47,000 people. The service area is 70,000. It's this medium-sized town, but it feels incredibly small. For some reason, it feels very similar to our town of 3,500 in Mora. You go to the grocery store, you know people. You go to the gym, you know people. You go downtown, you know people. And we've only been here for 9 months, so it has this incredible small town feel to it. And ironically, there's one public hospital and with 70 beds and only 16 ER beds, which is just mind blowing because in our town of 3,500, we have a 23 bed hospital and a 10 to 12 bed ER. The service population is half of that of Wanganui. And there's only one addiction center. I'll get into that a little bit more, but that includes outpatient, inpatient, that's everything. There's no halfway houses, there's no detox, there's just one. So I work at a clinic, it's called Gonville Health. I'm a GP there. So there are 2 full-time physicians, 4 nurse practitioners, and I said 2 to 3 practicing nurses. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't see my screen. 2 to 3 locums doctors that are kind of rotating through that are kind of doing similar things that I'm doing, but usually they're here for 6 to 8 week stints, and then they take off and go usually somewhere else in New Zealand. The patient population it's interesting because it's a transient population, so people are constantly coming and going. So there's, we have a patient population of 8,000 people, and there are 2,000 new people every year and 2,000 people who leave. So it's a very challenging population because, you're just starting to get to know somebody and then they leave, or you're knowing somebody or getting to know somebody who's brand new to the community. Or what a lot of times happens is people always come back to Wanganui. They call it the Hotel California. They leave, they live their life, they move to Australia, they move to Auckland, they move somewhere else. And then when they get old, they move back. And they bring us with all their complexities and their medical problems. And I was hoping to, leave Mora and come to New Zealand and have this incredibly easy job. But I left the exact same patients that I found here. So the patients are just as complex, just as poor, just as difficult as the patients I left in Mora, if not a little bit more. So it is not as cush or easy as I was hoping it to be, but it's 32 hours a week and it's not that bad. So part of the New Zealand population is the Maori population. It's tough to pronounce the word Maori. People pronounce it differently. A lot of times when I came over here, I would pronounce it Maori. That is clearly wrong. But it makes up 25% of our community. And it's an incredibly interesting culture. And New Zealand is doing a decent job trying to assimilate or include the Maori into the regular culture. There are 2 or 3 television networks that are entirely in Te Reo. Te Reo is the Maori language, and there are numerous radio stations. The Maori people have a seat in government or have multiple seats in government. So unlike the U.S. Indigenous people, New Zealand seems to at least be trying to right some wrongs and are really trying to include the Maori population in all of the decisions that are being made in government. And obviously there's some conflict around that, but I think their heart is in the right place. The Maori people, kind of similar to Native Americans, are at higher risk for healthcare discrepancy, healthcare problems. They're twice as likely to die of cardiovascular disease. They're more likely to die from cancer. Their life expectancy is significantly shorter, and their drug-related deaths are almost triple that of the non-Maori population. So what's interesting is the alcohol use amongst the Maori versus non-Maori is pretty similar. The Maori have more days of binge drinking, but the overall the alcohol use in general is very similar between Maori and non-Maori people. In our clinic, we're in a very poor area, so we have more Maori people than, say, a clinic across town, which makes it a little bit more challenging, just because our patients are generally a little bit sicker. And one more thing about Maori population, which is new to me coming to New Zealand, is they're very susceptible to rheumatic fever, and which is something that is pretty much non-existent in the United States. And they treat strep throat incredibly seriously here because at any one time there are numerous kids, usually kids in Auckland or Wellington, with rheumatic heart disease. And they think they're it's partially genetic, where they're more susceptible to it than non-Maori people, but it's also kind of their culture. So they're used to living in very close quarters. So it's not uncommon to have 3 or even 4 generations under one roof. And the roofs in New Zealand are not very big. The average home is 2 to 3 bedrooms and 1 bath. So there are people sleeping on the couch. There are people, and there's no basement. So these are all slab on grade homes. So it's not uncommon to have 12 or more people in a 3-bedroom house. So they think that's kind of part of the reason that they're more susceptible to rheumatic fever than the non-Maori population, because the risks of the non-Maori population is very similar to that of the United States. So it's when I get a patient, and I do a lot of urgent care stuff, when I get a patient that comes in with sore throat, and if they're Maori, there's a very good chance they're going to be getting on antibiotics until their strep test comes back negative. Because there's no such thing as a rapid strep test here. It's the old culture. So it takes 2 to 3 days to come back. So my new practice is if you come in with a sore throat and you're Maori, you're going to get antibiotics until your strep test comes back and it's negative 2 or 3 days from now. As far as the healthcare systems, they're incredibly different, but incredibly similar. So the medications are almost identical. The names are all different. They use a lot more generic names, so it's pretty easy transition. They don't use as much lisinopril. They use more ramipril. There's some nuances there, but in general, the medications are almost identical. There are a couple things, the big things that I've noticed is they don't have trazodone, which is super weird. They only have a medicine called zopiclone, which is similar to Lunesta for sleep, and they don't have any non-addicting medications for sleep, which is, I still can't figure out why. They don't use a lot of Wellbutrin. They don't use Wellbutrin for depression ever. They use it for smoking cessation every once in a while. And you cannot get metronidazole gel. So it's really hard to treat rosacea in patients without oral doxycycline, which is, if you ask me, is kind of silly. But other than those 3 medications, it's incredibly similar. The language, the way we speak, the way I talk to my colleagues at the hospital or emergency room it's identical. The standard of care is pretty much identical. The availability of technology is the same. The access to it is a little bit more challenging. The access or lack thereof to primary care. And as I talked about before, the medical complexities. The big difference is, so there's universal health care here. So everybody has insurance. So there's a portion of the population has private insurance in addition to the public insurance. But most people, especially in Wanganui, most people in the clinic that I'm working at are poor enough where they don't have the private insurance. Private insurance gets you access to the private system, which gets you access to care sooner. So that's the biggest challenge I see every day, is getting people access to specialty care. We have a service area of 70,000 people, and getting somebody to see a cardiologist takes an act of God. There are no cardiologists that come to Wanganui. There are internal medicine doctors who take an interest in cardiology or take an interest in nephrology, but there are no actual nephrologists, cardiologists, endocrinologists that come here. So the way they deal with it is the general medicine doctors at the hospital will take an interest in neurology or take an interest in this, and then they'll see the patient, and most of the time they can sort it out. But every once in a while, they'll have to send a patient to Wellington, which is 2.5 hours away, to see a cardiologist or a neurologist or a nephrologist. But getting somebody in to see even the general medicine doctor or an orthopedic surgeon is incredibly frustrating. But the difference here is the patient expectations. So if you told a patient in the United States, you're not going to see a cardiologist for 6 to 12 months, that would not go over well. Here, it's just the way it is. So it doesn't really bother people that much that they're like, yeah, I know it's going to be a while. I know it's going to be, 4 months to get into, get my ultrasound, or ultrasounds are backed up now. Sometimes it's taken 12 months or more to get an ultrasound. But the patients, they just accept it, and it's different. And you would think there would be a big difference in life expectancy, but New Zealanders live 8 years longer than they do in the United States. It's 6 to 8 years longer than they do in the United States. So even though it's hard to get access at times, they're still living way longer than us for some reason, and their obesity rate is very similar. Prescription drug costs are a lot cheaper here because it's all universal healthcare. They're pretty much all on generics. I don't have to play the game with the insurance company, which makes life a whole lot easier. And the other big difference, as I've found out, is addiction is incredibly different here than it is in the United States on multiple fronts. So while the systems are very similar, they're also very different. I would say they're more the same than different. The other challenge is they have a fragmented healthcare system. You would think because they have universal healthcare, everybody would be on the same page, and they would have one computer system and one everything. And the standard of care in Auckland would be the same as it is in Christchurch. But that is just not the case. There are 20 different district health boards, or DHBs. In July, when I first got here, they rolled out this universal system called Te Whatu Ora. And the goal of it is to have this kind of one encompassing healthcare system for the whole country. And their heart is in the right place for sure, and it's for sure what needs to be done. But it's this was rolled out in July of last year, and I have yet to see one tiny thing that says that anything has changed. So the standard of care in Wanganui is not necessarily the standard of care in Auckland. Auckland might as well be in a different country. It is, both from the city standpoint and the healthcare and the schooling. Auckland is very similar to a large U.S. city as far as standards of care, as far as schooling, as far as everything else. And the rest of the country is pretty much in a different country. So trying to kind of roll out the, this universal health system and the standard of care, trying to, get everybody on the same page. It's a goal, and it should slowly start to happen, but it hasn't quite happened yet. So as I'm doing my talk on addiction, what I'm discussing is addiction specifically in Wanganui, and the non-Auckland areas of New Zealand, because I don't know exactly what happens in Auckland, but kind of based on what I hear, I expect it's more similar to what happens in kind of a larger urban center in the United States. easier access, more specialty care available, more of everything, just because it's a bigger city and people, want to work there. Again, our service population is 70,000. So when we talk about the addiction program in Wanganui, it's called AOD, or alcohol and other drugs. I know that's kind of an old term for an alcohol program. My wife is a chemical dependency counselor, and she said, "Oh yeah, AOD." Okay, I haven't heard of it referred to that, but that's what it's referred to throughout the country. It's a publicly funded treatment program, so it's part of the universal health care. It's outpatient only. So there's one MAT provider. They call it opiate substitution therapy here, OST. And there's one other psychiatric provider who actually just met yesterday for the first time, who run the entire program. They have numerous nurses and nurse practitioners also working underneath them, but generally one provider providing all the scripts. So as of last week, he has 160 total patients, 130 of them are on methadone and 30 are on buprenorphine. It's just run a whole lot different than the opiate programs or the MAT programs in the United States. He was very intrigued to kind of hear how we run our program, specifically about the buprenorphine, because they just don't use a lot of it. And then, again, I don't know what happens in Auckland. I would maybe hope that there's more buprenorphine happening up there. But as I'll get into, they don't have a lot of opiate addiction in New Zealand, which is also just kind of mind blowing. So there are no inpatient centers, within 100 miles of Wanganui. So there are a couple inpatient centers in some of the bigger cities like Auckland and Christchurch and Wellington, but they really focus mainly on alcohol and meth. There's no detox centers either, which is kind of ironic because alcohol is a big problem in New Zealand. It's the Salvation Army does have a couple of quote detox centers, and the closest one is located about 60 miles away. So it's interesting the differences between this city of 45,000 and the city I'm used to of 3,500. And in Mora we have 1, 2, 3, 4 one big inpatient center and 4 halfway houses, and there's another inpatient center just 15 miles down the road. And then there's another outpatient center, 30 miles down the road. It's, incredible the lack of treatment options for, drugs in New Zealand. But it's not as big of a deal here either. Alcohol is for sure. But their biggest scourge right now is meth. It's interesting because I just found out how expensive meth is here, and it's between $200 and $500 a gram, which I think is just crazy expensive, coming from Mora, where they pretty much give it away, and I know they give it away. So the prescription opiates, they're not nearly the problem they are in the United States. Even 10 or 15 years ago, when opiate prescribing was rampant in the United States, it's not near to that level. The big things that are prescribed are tramadol and codeine. I would say they're prescribed probably 10 to 1 over morphine. And every once in a while, you'll see somebody on oxycodone. Hydrocodone doesn't exist here. And very rarely will you see a fentanyl patch. In fact, when you use the word fentanyl, everybody thinks you're referring to fentanyl patches. Even providers really don't know what fentanyl is outside of the patches. There's something you would give in the hospital. But there's this naivety around opiates as well. So there's less awareness surrounding the dangers. When I got here, I was just kind of shell shocked at how there really wasn't a lot of awareness amongst providers or amongst patients. They all were kind of annoyed that patients were getting narcotics, but there were no really alarms that were going off. So, and that was amongst providers who have been there for 30 years. There was amongst providers who just got there. That was amongst people who were just getting out of school. So there's not a lot of awareness surrounding opiates, and the same goes for patients. It's it's been really a unique experience because I'll tell patients, you know that medicines like tramadol and codeine cause more harm than good, and that really, and it's been like super easy to convince people that they shouldn't be on tramadol or codeine or morphine. And I've tapered, I don't even know, dozens of people since I've been here, and it was the easiest taper that I've ever done. They were just like, okay, I guess I won't take it anymore. You said it harms me. And so it's and amongst the providers as well. I mean, they've been really open to this, and there's just been this huge cultural shift since I've been there, just trying to educate people about the dangers of tramadol and codeine, and it's no longer necessarily a fight anymore to get them to come in. It's these are going to be the rules, and we talked about how the newer research suggests that codeine and tramadol are just as harmful and just as addicting as other opiates. So it's been eye-opening, but it's also been really interesting to see this transition, and this that there's now this incredible awareness both from the patients and the providers surrounding, at the very least, prescription opioids. And as I've kind of alluded to, there's just not a lot of non-prescription opioids that are happening right now, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So there's some prescriber monitoring because we're all under the same system as doctors, but generally it's underutilized. It's only used if an actual problem has been identified. There's no kind of screening. There's nothing that happens like in Minnesota where you're constantly scrutinized about every prescription that you write. And part of that is codeine and tramadol are not monitored. And like I said, they're prescribed at least 10-1 compared to morphine. The other thing that I thought was mind-blowing is people don't know what naloxone is. It is not prescribed. It's not prescribed by the AOD prescribers. It's just not a thing. It's not prescribed by the chronic pain clinic. And when I mentioned it, there was a patient who was on a high amount of morphine. There was so much confusion in the room when I suggested it. It was interesting, but again, there's just not a lot of it around either, and that was the exception and not the rule. And there's wide variation in benzos. I would say it's kind of the same level of awareness as other prescription opioids. People are definitely not aware of the risks of benzos and opioids together. That's been, I've been, educating patients and providers, about the co-prescribing of the two. Even amongst the MAT program here in town, I would say at least a quarter of them are on benzos. And talking to the provider, he says that that's going to vary, between districts as well. Some districts have a hard stance on benzos. He does not have a hard stance on benzos. So he takes it on a very individual basis and feels that, they're generally, they're safe and it's helpful, and that he'll continue the benzos along with the methadone. So this is an interesting meme of a rock and a hard place. I don't know if it's actually true, but this is sheep are very New Zealand. But the treatment of chronic pain here is challenging at best. When you have your prototypical 65-year-old female who comes in with hip pain and she's got arthritis in that hip, it is challenging to treat because the biggest problem is their obesity rate, which is maybe just a little bit less, but similar to the United States. But surgeons will not operate with a BMI greater than 40. It's a hard stop. They will say no, 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 even if it's, the patient is in debilitating pain and can't get out of bed. They're not getting a new hip until their BMI is less than 40. Even if they did have a BMI less than 40, I saw a patient yesterday. She had waited 6 months to see the surgeon, and she saw the surgeon last week, and he said, well, it's going to be another 6 months until we can do the surgery. So from the time I said you need a new hip to the time she gets a new hip, it's going to be at the very least 12 months. So trying to buy her time between now and then is challenging. And because as we've got Tylenol, we've got NSAIDs, and not much else works that's not a narcotic. Physio and cortisone injections are also very challenging. It's okay if I can do an injection, but if they have really bad knees and I'm uncomfortable doing an injection, or they're obese and I don't have a needle long enough to do the injection, they're not going to get one. I can't just send them to see ortho to get an ultrasound guided knee injection. I can't send them to see ultrasound for a knee injection. It just doesn't happen. It's even worse with hip arthritis. You've got these patients who are waiting, 12 to 18 months for a new hip, or 24 months for a new hip. They're not doing injections. It's not a thing. I'm not, I don't believe that injections work that much, but it's sometimes biased to a couple months, which is what these patients are looking for. And so I've had a very difficult conversation numerous times with patients saying, hey, you're stuck. There is, you've got a BMI of 50, you can't move, you're going to the pool, you've met with a dietitian. I don't know what to do. Here's some tramadol. It's been, gut wrenching for me, because I have nothing for these patients, and nobody does, and nobody seems to have a solution for these patients, because it is just not uncommon at all to have somebody who's got a BMI that's too high and a horrible hip, and they're 55 years old, or one was 48, and they've got should have a long life ahead of them, and they're relegated to opioids at an early age because there's nothing else for them. You might suggest gastric bypass, which I would too. The Wanganui is allowed to do 2 gastric bypasses a year publicly. So if you are that lucky patient, then that's great. Otherwise, you're not going to get a gastric bypass publicly. The plus side is if you pay privately, as of last week, the gastric bypass is going to cost $21,000, which I did not think was terrible. I don't know how much it costs in the U.S., but I would say at least $100,000. So that includes the whole program. That includes meeting with physio. That includes meeting with the pharmacy. That includes the dietary consults. That includes psych. So it's $21,000 for gastric bypass, and again, that's going privately, and you're going to drive 2.5 hours to Wellington for that surgery. But sometimes for these patients, it's their only option. Substance abuse in general here, it's interesting. There's a lot of alcohol. There's a fair amount of meth, but it's hard to imagine that too many people are using when it's $200 to $500 a gram. I know it exists. I know it's around, and you hear about it all the time. But it's really expensive. Ritalin is abused as well. There is very, very little Adderall. It is really challenging to prove that you need Adderall. The vast majority of kids and the vast majority of adults who are on stimulants, they get some version of Ritalin. And like I said, there's some opiates. The most widely abused opiate in New Zealand is methadone. And ironically, we're treating methadone addiction with methadone. And even if we can get down to a reasonable dose of methadone, we're still treating it with methadone. So it's really challenging when I say, I see you're on methadone. You should go see the methadone clinic. And it just doesn't go over very well. There's minimal heroin and there's absolutely no fentanyl, and it is crazy. When we first got here in June, there was a 12 people in Auckland that had a non-fatal overdose of fentanyl. And to my knowledge, to the person in charge of the AOD program in town, that is the only grumbling of any fentanyl in the country. Was 9 months ago now, and it was 12 people that had a non-fatal overdose and did just fine. So it's mind-blowing that it's not here. But there also isn't not a lot of heroin either. You would think that it would just kind of cross because China's not that far away. But it's just not here. There is some cocaine. Ironically or interestingly, there was a dump between Australia and New Zealand where they found millions of dollars of cocaine. It was the most cocaine ever seized, I think, in the world. They just found it floating in the ocean. Clearly, there was meant to be a pickup. And they said, well, there's no way that this cocaine is meant for New Zealand because that would sustain New Zealand for 30 years. So they thought that that cocaine had to be destined for Australia just based on the pure quantity of it. So it was really interesting hearing that story. But again, it was cocaine and not fentanyl and definitely not heroin. And tramadol and codeine are definitely abused. Not to the extent of like an oxycodone or hydrocodone in the United States, but it happens. And helping to educate patients is really kind of showing a little difference. Pot. So, when we moved here, I thought that it was going to be a very liberal country. I thought there would be weed everywhere. And that's not the truth either. So there was a referendum that failed to legalize marijuana in 2020 and failed. It was kind of, it was a close vote, but it failed. And there's talk about another referendum in the next couple of years. But the community use is said to be 15 to 20%, which to me seems high. I have not walked through one marijuana cloud since I've been here. It's there, you just don't smell it. It's not around. I know that it exists, but there seems to be more of a stigma surrounding it, a negative stigma. It's not as widely accepted as it is in the United States. I talk to patients like, why don't you just, why aren't you doing more weed? And they're like, because I'm terrified of it. They might do a drug screen at work and I might lose my job. So it's interesting to see how, something like that, there's generally some respect around it in the community, and it's not, it just doesn't happen. We go skiing, and when you go skiing in Colorado, you're just constantly going through, weed clouds, and it just doesn't happen here. There is medicinal THC available. I can prescribe it. It's incredibly expensive. It's like $800 a month, and it's apparently just not very good. So nobody wants it. And the other thing that's interesting is CBD is available by prescription only, and it is the greatest placebo ever. Patients come to me and they say they want CBD for their pain. I say, here you go. They want it for their sleep. I said, here you go. If I can't, gabapentin used to be the greatest placebo, and now CBD is the greatest placebo. I'm not going to prescribe it to them. I'm not going to say, hey, you should try CBD. But if they come to me and say, I want CBD, yeah, knock yourself out. And I didn't mention vaping or cigarette use. Cigarette use, it's I think it's about 17% of the country is using cigarettes or tobacco of some form. That seems high to me. You just don't see it as much as you would in the United States. And cigarettes are $40 a pack, which is, they're so taxed. It's unbelievable. Most people who are smoking or rolling their own cigarettes, they call them rollies. There's a fair amount of vaping. Vaping is really kind of exploded here as it has in the United States. One thing that I found out recently is in Australia, vaping is illegal. You can only get it by prescription only. That has nothing to do with New Zealand, but I thought that it was interesting that, there's no vaping generally in Australia unless it's available by prescription for the sole purpose of using it for smoking cessation. As far as opioids go, most start with methadone or morphine and they using it recreationally. There's a much smaller population gets their start from prescriptions. The heroin that's around, generally there's just not any heroin around. And people who used heroin used it 20 years ago and are still on methadone. And they were making home-baked heroin with codeine. Apparently there's a process where you can methylate the heroin or demethylate the heroin or the codeine to make, it's called home-baked heroin. So 20 years ago, that was a huge problem. It's not as much of a problem anymore because it's a little bit more challenging to get codeine because 20 years ago, codeine was available without a prescription. So New Zealand has a population of over 5 million. These are the numbers of 5 years. This is over 5 years for New Zealand. And you can see that there are just not a ton of opioid-related deaths. To me, these numbers are staggering. Especially when you compare it to the United States, where, in the similar population in the United States, it would be, quadruple this or more. The treatment of opioid use disorder, generally it's methadone. There's some buprenorphine, and again, it's going to vary between the 20 districts. And there's minimal to no naltrexone. There's no Vivitrol. When I talked to the provider at AOD, it just wasn't even an option. And the same thing goes for alcohol. It's not used. I tried to prescribe it the other day, and there are a couple medications where there's a hard stop where I can't prescribe it because it needs what's called specialty authority or special authority, where I need a psychiatrist or somebody from alcohol and other drugs to write the initial prescription. And then once they get a special number, and then I can write further prescriptions. But I was unable to prescribe just run-of-the-mill naltrexone for somebody with alcohol use disorder. It's interesting here. So bars are just not popular. People drink, they drink at home. They have a national holiday called Crate Day. Everybody knows about it. It was like the first Saturday in December. People just go out and buy a case of beer, and your goal is to drink that case of beer that day. And I mean, it was unbelievable how many people knew about Crate Day. One of the nurses at clinic like, "Oh, my son's having Crate Day today. He won't be around tomorrow." And that's just what people do. They drink at home. And bars are just not as popular. You go downtown after 8 p.m. and it's dead. There's nothing happening downtown. People are at home. But the alcohol abuse rates are very similar to what they are in the United States. And it's kind of surprising because alcohol is expensive. To buy a 6-pack of good beer, it's going to cost $20, and that $20 US. And to buy, a 12-pack of, regular beer, something like a Busch Light or a Budweiser would still, would be like $23, $24, US. Wine is a little bit cheaper. Wine is pretty similar to where it is in the States. They have this drink called Scrumpy, which is it's a really cheap cider. So when people are drinking, a lot of them are drinking Scrumpy, and it comes in a clear greenish plastic bottle. Looks like a Sprite. It's got, I think, 9% alcohol in it. So there are tons of people who are abusing Scrumpy. They'll just buy it by the case because it's relatively cheap. Alcohol is referred to as piss here. And everything is, I'm going to go buy some piss. I'm going to go get pissed. And it's interesting. Like the first time I heard it, it didn't resonate with me, but it's when people say that, and it's everybody just says it. The old people, young people want to go get pissed tonight. And it's interesting culture difference here. And like I said, GPs can't prescribe naltrexone. There's some AA and NA, but they're not widely attended. And I think that has to do, I don't know this for certain, but there's just way less religion here. I don't know of anybody who attends church. There are a couple of them around our town. but it is just not a very religious country. So I suspect that has something to do with why they're, AA and NA aren't quite as prevalent as they are in the United States. In Wanganui, there's one AA meeting, no NA meetings. There's a city called Palmerston North, which is 60 miles away. There is an NA meeting. I don't know how widely attended these are, though. The other challenges are mental health access. Unless you were actively suicidal, like you actually attempted suicide, not just said it, like actually you attempted it and failed, or you're dangerously psychotic, you're not going to get immediate help. It's unbelievable. And I can't tell you how many people have gone to the emergency room for a suicide attempt and just left the emergency room before they could get help. They're not put on a hold. They just walk up and leave and nobody stops them. So it's really challenging to get people psychiatric care. There's really thick stigma surrounding mental illness, especially amongst the Maori population. I've been trying for 9 months now to get people counseling. I'm confident that one person so far has seen a counselor. It's really challenging, and the counselors are, I've been told, not the greatest, but I think it's kind of like anywhere where you're going to have good counselors and bad counselors, and you just kind of have to figure out what works for you. But you first have to get in the door, and nobody's getting in the door. So I've, as a GP, I have a handful of patients that come to see me now for counseling. I have no idea what I'm doing. We do motivational interviewing, and that's pretty much where I draw the line. I just hear them out, and I hope that I'm helping them because I don't know what else to do. But they keep coming back to see me, and they're still alive. So I think that's I'm winning battle. The other thing that was surprising moving to New Zealand is the trauma. There is so much trauma here. It's staggering how many people come in and say, I was raped when I was 5. I was raped when I was 12. My brother raped me. My dad raped me. My stepdad. It is just mind blowing. I mean, pretty much anybody who sees me for mental illness has a history of brutal trauma. And there's family violence. This is the first billboard you see when you come to Wanganui. This is the billboard that you see. It's an incredible problem. Part of it, they think is because this was kind of part of the Maori culture, 150 years ago, and it's just kind of perseverated, but it's not just Maoris, it's everybody. And I don't have any statistics on where it's more prevalent versus Maori versus non-Maori, but it is just everywhere in the community. And trying to get people help for their trauma and their PTSD is challenging. They're coming to see me to talk about it, and it's stuff that I wish I could unhear. You can really understand from a mental illness standpoint, where they're coming from, because it would be a tough life to live, having that in the background. So it's been an eye-opening experience for me, dealing with mental health and dealing with this trauma that I'm not experienced enough to deal with professionally, but I do the best that I can with it. It's been a very interesting experience. So I like to take pictures of crazy road signs here. And that tsunami sign that I had earlier, that was from just up the street. We live in a tsunami area, so we have an evacuation route posted at the end of our driveway. This picture was taken at the top of Mount Ruapehu, which if the sun were up, you could see behind our house. People bike up this thing every day, and they go down it at 50 miles an hour, and it is just the craziest downhill ever. And if this is the actual road sign that's showing that's at the top of the mountain. And there's so many interesting, very blunt road signs here in New Zealand. So, is this the future of the opioid crisis in New Zealand, or is this planet New Zealand? Is this, are they protected enough? Being this tiny little island in the South Pacific, they've made it this far without fentanyl. They've made it this far without heroin. Maybe there's hope that it's going to skirt by them. This is a picture taken from the tip of the North Island, Cape Rena. So this is the far north point. Where we're looking at right now, it's where the Tasman Sea and the Pacific Ocean come together. And it's really interesting. You can actually watch the waves collide. You would think you wouldn't see anything. But you can actually see like a hard line where the sea and the ocean come together. I would have would have thought it would have just been an imaginary line, where somebody said that this is where the sea ends and the ocean begins, but there's a clear defining point where that happens. So it's been an incredible experience for us here in New Zealand. I would highly recommend it to anybody. There's so much to do here. What I tell people is, like, if you take everything that's cool about the United States and you compress it into these two small islands, there's an ocean that literally 300 yards that way. There's a mountain an hour and a half that way. And everything that's cool about the United States is all within 4-hour drive from here. And if you need to go somewhere, if you need to go to the South Island, there's an airport here, and you'll be on the South Island, which is where all the ski fields are, and they call them the fjord lands, and the Southern Alps are all on the South Island. So you just take a 1-hour plane ride to the South Island, and it's all there. I try not to work very hard. It's been a very enlightening experience. I'm hopeful that Christy will still like me when I come home, because I'm not going to work as hard. Just because it's been just a whole new appreciation for life moving here. This is time to kind of hang out with your neighbors. It's downtime that we never had, even living in a small town in Mora, because everybody's just busy. You're always doing things, and here nobody's busy. It's awesome. One of the interesting things was, so after Christmas in the United States, we go back to work on December 26th. After Christmas here, whole country shuts down for 2 weeks. Like, you can't go to the store because the store is closed. You can't get anything done on your house because all the builders, all the electricians, all the plumbers, everybody's at home. And, initially it was kind of annoying, because when do you want to go to the store? When do you want to get things done? It's over Christmas, and you can't do it. But then you just appreciate the fact that all these people are just at home, and they have this big phrase called time rich, and they're incredibly time rich here. So it was a really awesome experience. And we've still got 4 months left here. We've got a lot of really big trips planned over the next 4 months. So our kids are kind of excited to come back. I should say our kids are excited to come back tomorrow. My wife and I are kind of excited to come back tomorrow. But it's going to be a tough life to live, or tough life to leave here.
So, Matt, we have like a few thousand questions, and I'll try and summarize a couple of them. It's interesting because, Christine Bell just mentioned, with all this trauma and probably these ACE scores that are so high, why is there so little addiction? I mean, to me, we certainly in our country, we link those two things, right?
Right. And I think there's addiction. It's in the form of alcohol and, maybe meth. And there's, why is there so little opiate addiction would be the bigger question. I don't have that answer. I suspect it's because, in the United States, we created our opiate crisis. It's homegrown. It's, because, we started doling out these prescriptions 20 years ago, and that just didn't happen here. But again, that's just me kind of surmising that that's what happened. I don't know truly why there's no heroin here. I don't know why China or Mexico forgot about New Zealand, but there's a lot of addiction, and specifically around alcohol. But there's just the opiate addiction just isn't here.
Yeah. Do they have social workers? Some of your staff are saying you probably miss your social workers. So do you have those? Do they exist?
So we have these things called health coaches. It's basically like a patient advocate. So they're not social workers, they're not therapists, but they help us kind of bridge the gap. between when somebody can see an actual therapist or a counselor. So we have 4 of them at our clinic. They're awesome. They act very much so like a social worker. Some of them have a social work background, a couple of them have a nursing background, a couple are just hippies and like to help people. So I should have mentioned them. They do an excellent job kind of bridging that gap. There are lots of different programs available in the community that I'm not necessarily aware of. They're kind of nuanced programs that kind of help, kids and their moms or men or things that wouldn't be on my radar. So they're able to kind of plug people into those kind of nuanced programs. And for some patients, they work great, and they don't even need to see a therapist because they do a really good job of coping skills and helping people get out of the house and exercise, and work on mindfulness. Sometimes I send people to them and they say, well, why did you send me to this person? That's not what I need. I need a therapist. I know.
Well, and just to be clear, Christy, he's not suggesting he's going to replace the social workers with these people, right? I didn't hear that, but with methamphetamine, do they do particular treatments for that there? I mean, if they got more meth, what's their treatment? Are they using the topiramate and the other meds, or nothing?
Nothing. It was funny, but I just talked to the other addiction specialist yesterday, and I asked her that very same question, and she said nothing. This is where some of the inpatient units in the bigger cities come into play, because abstinence is, but it's prolonged abstinence of meth. So that's why people are at some of these inpatient centers for 3 to 6 to 12 months. But generally, her advice was you just keep trying.
Tough it out.
Tough it out. Right. And, if they keep coming back to you, you just keep telling them, they're doing the right thing. And the more you do it, the more likely at some point it's going to stick. And, there's some truth to that. But they're not doing anything more or less than we're doing.
I think it's amazing because there you could be the addiction specialist, right? I mean, you could be. Is that frustrating?
It is. It's frustrating, but it's also, it's been great to just be able to come here with an open mind and just kind of provide some education on how to deal with chronic opioids, and and educate patients and providers about the dangers of opioids, because they weren't aware of this prior to my arrival, really. And I'm not saying I'm solely responsible for doing that, but it's been just a really neat kind of transition over the past 9 months to just kind of watch the clinic's mentality just kind of shift. Wow.
Do you see much of the kind of the over the counter stuff that we see, like Kratom, those types of things?
No. I don't know if it bypasses me. I don't know if patients, because when you're seeing patients for opiate addiction, as you know, they're very honest. They're brutally honest. They'll tell you where their drug dealer lives. And so I'm not, with the patients here, I'm not necessarily, I'm not able to break through that barrier with them because I'm not treating them for their heroin addiction. So I'm not necessarily getting to that next level of honesty with them. But I haven't heard a whisper of kratom. I haven't heard a whisper of bath salts, anything like that. There are vape shops in town. There's a half dozen vape shops, but there are no real head shops either. There's no place selling, meth pipes. There's no place selling bongs. There's no place selling that paraphernalia that you would get in Mora.
I can't imagine it's not going to be a little difficult to come back when we look at patient expectations of, especially for opioids. How are you going to deal with that when suddenly, because in our world, right, you walk in and they're like, I really need pain pills for this, right? And you don't get it probably now.
Right. The expectations are amongst pain pills. It's, the people that we've talked about pain pills, it's been that little old lady who needs a new hip, and I'm basically I'm not forcing her, I'm educating her that she might need some tramadol because she's got no other options. But as far as other patients who, that you're 33-year-old dude with low back pain, it's not even on the table. It's not even, I haven't offered it to him. He didn't ask for it. I said that you should take this great drug called paracetamol, and which is Tylenol, or this other great drug called ibuprofen. And the thing I didn't mention is, as NSAIDs here are a little bit higher, a little bit more tightly regulated. So you can get them without a prescription for sure, but you can only get 20. You can't get lots of 100. You can't get lots of 1,000. You can online, but at the pharmacy you can't get them. And if you're on an NSAID in clinic, they'll take you very seriously, and they'll be doing 3-month renal checks on you.
Wow.
Right. And they'll be watching your GFR, with a fine tooth comb if you're on NSAIDs. So there's a whole lot more respect surrounding NSAIDs here. They're still giving too high a doses, but at least they're respecting the drug.
One of the things you didn't bring up is homelessness, right? And we see so much homelessness in the addiction crowd. So do you have homelessness?
We do. It's I don't see a lot of it, but I know that it exists. Part of it is because of the government system here. Basically, it's really hard to be homeless here. The government programs will put you in a home. They'll give you payments, similar to like welfare, but they'll give you enough to put you in a home. That's what I'm seeing from 30,000 feet. If you ask my neighbor, he's very opinionated. He'll say that you have to choose to be homeless here in New Zealand. When I asked, we had a friend who was a social worker in Christchurch, and she had a different opinion. She felt that the homeless population is going up. For sure, she did not agree with my neighbor, but there's way less homelessness, and with its temperate climate. I mean, the coldest it got last year was 45 degrees. You would think there would be homeless camps everywhere, and I've maybe seen 5 since I've been here.
Wow.
So there's just not a lot of homeless people here in Wanganui. There's more in Auckland and Christchurch, but I mean, if you're homeless and you can get to New Zealand, man, I would come here for sure.
Well, one last question before we go is to respect everybody's time and yours, because it's early and you probably got to go to work today. My running partner is a pharmacist, and he put in this question about weight loss drugs. Are there, when we're trying to get patients those kind of things, the big rage now is those Ozempics and different things like that. Is there any of that you can prescribe for people trying to get their weight down?
Yeah. So, why am I blanking on the term? What's the stimulant that we use in the States?
Phentermine?
Yes. So phentermine is available. It's prescribed. You can only prescribe it for 3 months though. And there's a hard stop at 3 months. So a lot of times people will lose a bit of weight, and then they'll come back in a year and get another course of phentermine.
Wow.
As you know, it may or may not actually work. I mean, people lose weight on it, but they seem to all gain it back. And so we have that conversation, but it's happened more here than it ever did in Mora. The diabetic agents, the Ozempic's not available, but the other one is. But it was briefly opened for weight loss and diabetics. And that door shut very, very quickly about 6 months ago because there's just such a shortage of it. So now it can only be prescribed if you have diabetes and it's not under control with metformin and sulfonylurea.
Wow.
So it's prescribed for sure, but only for diabetes. And, we keep hearing grumblings of, that they're going to open it up once there's less of a shortage. But for now, there's kind of a pause button. So when I'm seeing patients like now, and I kind of tell them about phentermine, and we call it Duramine here. But I say, well, we should think about that $21,000 gastric bypass, because in the big picture, that's not that expensive. It's easy for me to say that, but there's some hope in the future with these diabetic agents.
Wow.
I was just watching the local news yesterday, and they had probably a 15-minute story on the diabetic agents. So there's a lot of public knowledge around it. It's not quite here yet.
Interesting. Well, geez, Matt, we really appreciate your time. This was very interesting. It's just hard, I think, for me to imagine that things can be so different. I mean, I think we all expect that the opioids and the addiction and all that's going to be pretty much the same everywhere, but clearly not the case. It's different everywhere. So, wow. So we really appreciate your time and thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody wants more information on New Zealand or what I'm doing here, feel free to hit me up and happy to share it with you.
Yeah, I think for me, the interesting thing is going to be is what Christy says when you get back and whether you really do slow down and not work.
So, well, I think that my first thing is I'll stop working in the ER. So that'll be the easiest thing to slow down on.
Well, we'll wait to hear the reports. So again, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for attending. We had a big group for you today. We had over 90 there for much of the talk. So one of our nicest groups in a while. So people are really quite interested. All right. Well, take care, everybody. Have a good week. Thanks again, Matt. Take care.